Thank you for that. So the last question I wanted to ask in relation to Suraj Prakash was about what it says about Vaisakhi. So I know it's just around the corner from the point that we're recording, obviously. But the earliest accounts that I've come across from Sikh history written by Koer Singh and Kaushish. Now, Koer Singh states that goats are slaughtered by Guru Sahib once the individuals heed Guru Sahib's call on that day. Kaushish's story is slightly different in that it's the individuals who heed Guru Sahib's call who do the Chatka, not Guru Sahib. And then he also specifically mentions the Panj Baniya that are recited on that day. What does Kavi Santokh Singh ji say? What does Suraj Prakash say about this event, and how does he absorb the sources that come before him?
I think it utilizes those texts. Those I can't talk into exact specifics, but the general story is there is that the guru is calling people up. Most of the crowd think the guru has gone insane, and there's context to that as well in relating to the stories about Nana Devi and relating to Devi becoming Pargat and kind of the guru, meaning that the Chandi, the goddess, had become manifest in front of the guru. And bless the guru with a sword, a kripa and a khanda, etc. So the story is very much like the pre-colonial sources that you mentioned, Koer Singh, Kaushish. There's Sukha Singh's Guru Lajpat Dasimi as well, which Santokh Singh is using both of those, it appears. And I would also add Bansabi Nama also has a similar type of rendition to that. So Pant Prakash by Ratan Singh Pangu also has a very similar account to that. So all of these texts fall in line with a similar type of version of events. Like you mentioned, Kaushish mentions various Barneys that are perhaps not mentioned by Santokh Singh's. Ratan Singh Pangu also deviates a little bit from that list as well. So there's going to be small differences here and there in regard to the story, but that story about the tent and the goats, I think, is pretty widely established in the pre-colonial literature, and that's going to seem very shocking to people who have not engaged with pre-colonial literature. But one thing I would add to that is that it really falls in line when you think about the stories of Guru Gobind Singh in regard to the master of the Charitas. Like this is somebody who wrote his largest composition was on deception, Charitabhakyan. And then what do you have there? You have a story about the Guru, enacting some deception. He's calling things up. He's calling Sikhs up. He goes into a tent. He comes out. There's a bloody sword. you know, it falls very much in line with kind of the personality that we imagine of the Guru. And even other stories like that the Guru writes himself in the Charitas about, him going to a certain Tirat, a certain pilgrimage spot, and like he's basically asked like the Sikhs to go collect sropas from people, and they start like knocking people's pugs off and taking them. I mean, it matches with the personality of the Guru. But yeah, I mean that point is shocking to people. I think for whom they imagine the Guru, I think the story goes for most people that he decapitated them himself in front of everybody, and then he put the heads back on, etc.
And the extra masala is the heads were added to the wrong bodies, and they still.
Yeah, which which I would add, like those types of mythological stories, you're not gonna find them in Suraj Prakash and Pant Prakash and these type of things for other events. So it's not. So like for those who are like, oh, Suraj Prakash doesn't believe the Guru can do all these miracles and stuff, I'd be like, read further. You're gonna find some fantastical stories in there as well, but not for that particular event. And yeah, for those people that really enjoy that story, which I understand, right? Like, and this is our conception of the divine as well. That the divine gives life, the divine takes life, and divine can kind of restore life, and that every Sikh would agree on that point, that the divine has these capabilities, that Sarabhaka Samrat, that the Guru has all powers and all that. So, those who are giving or shedding light on these stories, mind you, every single pre-colonial, like all of these pre-colonial, right? It doesn't mean that we think the Guru is like incapable, or that, we're trying to slander the Guru or anything like that. I think, if anything, I think the way that these stories are written kind of reinforces and kind of in a really entertaining way kind of describe the characteristics and the personality of the Guru, um, which I think is a really fun way of looking at it.
Does this have any relation to Chatka then, or is that kind of something completely different?
That's a good question. That's a question that relates back to the Chandi, and kind of sacrificing a goat, etc. But the beheading, like it's interesting. Suraj Prakash, there's a portion after when Guru Gobind Singh leaves Mashiwar jungle, and it says he does Chatka, but the way he does Chatka is with a rifle, with a gun, and he shoots a goat in the head, which alerts everybody around that village. And it's a really funny story, the way it's written in Suraj Prakash, because he does this Chatka with a rifle. He shoots a goat in the head, and then he takes that corpse and he like throws it at like there's like a Muslim who's reading, I think Kalma, is like doing the bong. He's like kind of on top of a mosque or something, and he's kind of reciting something, and he throws it at that guy. There's some story like that. Now I may be like off on some specifics, but so Chatka not necessarily needs to be done with a sword, as mentioned in these texts, but there is an element which Nahangs talk about, especially the older Nahangs, as well. First of all, they think about the sword as Chandi, right? This is like embedded within the writings of Guru Gobind Singh as well, is that, you know, the divine, the goddess, the Shakti of the divine as well is related to Shastra, not only the sword, but also a gun as well. Like, so for example, people always have this assumption that guns came after the Guru's period. And it's something that we should talk about more because it's really fascinating, that Guru Gobind Singh wrote more praise of the gun than he did the sword. If you read Shastra Namala, this text of, you know, the rosary of weapon names, Guru Gobind Singh writes in Dasam Guru Granth Sahib, there's more components there about rifles, which they had at that point, matchlock, flintlock rifles, than swords. Um, and so yeah, so rifles were used at that time. Contemporary sources even talk about Guru Hargobind having, I think, a 60 riflemen with him at all times, like riflemen with him. So, and we know, like, you know, even Guru Hargobind had a pistol in one of the battles. It describes like the pistol was brought from a far off land, Vilayat, it mentions. So probably Afghanistan, maybe even Europe. So, yeah, so Chatka not need be only with a sword, but yeah, it relates to notions about sacrificing for the divine, for Chandi. And, you know, Nahangs could go deeper into the mythology and the imagery of that, as well. You know, the goat representing, you know, Kam, Krodh, Adik, like these kind of animal temptations and vices and instincts. And by chopping off the head, we are removing our, you know, even the Amrit ceremony as well is that, right? We offer our head. They always say to you, like at the dal, they say, "Sis Guruka," is your head the Guru's? And then they give you Amrit only after that, right? So that's the imagery as well, is that we are now removing our head and you know, removing our incense, and we're giving our mat to the Guru. Like we take on the Guru's mat, not our own, not manmat, but gurmat. We take on the Guru's teachings. So I mean, we could go on and on about the philosophy about Chatka, and it's funny now we're seeing that in the West happen as well, which is really cool. That the diaspora communities are reading back at these old texts and you know, bringing a lot forward. I've seen Chatka be performed in Surrey. I've seen it being performed in UK, and for sure it's been happening out here in Seattle and California as well. So
I think we'll certainly do a podcast on in future about Chatka. There were just two questions then that I wanted to ask you about. These were the most commonly requested questions to ask you from our audience. The first is about the manifestation of Chandima Naina Devi, as you already mentioned, and the other is about what Kavi Santokh Singh says about Ragmala.
Yeah, we'll start with the Chandi thing. Is number one is, like, for example, Veer Singh had an, okay, so just to set the scene, you know, before Amrit Sanchar ceremony in 1699, a year before that, these texts, Santokh Singh, along with others like Koer Singh, Sukha Singh, these are written in the 1700s. Sikhandi Pagatamala also talks about Chandi becoming Padagat, Chandi becoming manifest. You know, this is a writing of Paimani Singh. So Santokh Singh is following in that tradition. You know, Santokh Singh is not inventing the wheel here and talking about Chandi becoming Padagat, becoming manifest. To Guru Gobind Singh, over time, this gets refined, this gets reinterpreted in different ways. For example, Gyan Singh, Gyani Gyan Singh, very famous Nodamala, in the late 19th century, talks about how what really became manifest through this fire, through this heaven, was a sword. And then Guru picked up the sword, and then he kind of used that sword in the Amar Sanchar ceremony, which is, he's taking a meaning from these stories and then he's interpreting it in a way that his audience perhaps would better deal with that story, because by that time of the early 1900s, notions about mythology and specifically Chandi were, not well accepted. I will mention that. So then the task becomes, how do we understand these stories from the 1700s, which deal with Chandi and Guru Gobind Singh, especially these stories about Chandi, not that Guru Gobind Singh writes the divine in a martial feminine light, because that can be easily understood. Just like how in Ad Guru Granth Sahib you have the divine often, written about through Vaishnava terminology, Ram, Raja Ram, like that's obviously talking about Ramchandra, but it's not talking about Ramchandra as only Ramchandra. So there's a use of Vaishnavite terminology, and then there's a shift and repurposing for our own purposes, for Sikh purposes. In the same way, Chandi is being utilized, just like Raja Ram and Gopal, Kavalan, all these words that would be used for Krishna, etc. as well. Chandi, and there's a repurposed version of that in Guru Gobind Singh's Bani as well. So that's fine. But now, how do we interpret the stories where authors are remarking of Guru Gobind Singh, performing a havan, performing a fire ceremony, and then Chandi becomes manifest? I would say, and this is something that's interesting when studying. So what I do at what am I doing my dissertation in is historiography, studying when that means like how history is written, not just history, not just dates, but like why are historians writing in the way they are writing. And what comes out is this story about Chandi Devi becoming Padagat manifest. We are not the only ones who hold that story. In other Kshatriya and other warrior class groups of that time, their leaders were also doing havans and making Chandi become Padagat as well, which is really interesting, right? Because then it relates to ideas relating to kingship, it relates to royalty, it relates to the notion that one has the power to, fight in battle, to take on empires, to construct communities, etc. There's many reasons why perhaps these stories are being utilized in this way, but for sure the people at that time had this notion that Guru Gobind Singh was in some sense manifesting Chandi, and what that means can differ according to the level of nuance that you want to go into. Does it mean that the Guru was manifesting Shakti, some type of energy, and that he was inspiring that and he was transferring that inspiration into his Singhs, right? Why did he name us Singhs? Like Bansavinama and these texts mention that he named the community Singh because Singh is the Bahan, is the vehicle on which Chandi rides. What is Chandi? The sword. And that we are holding that sword, right? So there's many different ways and imagery which are being utilized here in which we can interpret beyond just, oh, did Guru Gobind Singh physically make some being that we all would view as, Hindu manifest. So I would just say that we have to think about these a little bit deeper, especially in regard to storytelling techniques and devices and what the Guru is drawing out from that. So one thing is clear is that, all these pre-colonial texts are mentioning these type of stories. Veer Singh, when he publishes Pant Prakash, he takes portions of the Devi out of Pant Prakash, which is, I find, really intriguing, fascinating, because when he's putting in his introduction that we should not edit text of Suraj Prakash, I find that, yeah. But that point, right, about Devi is something that I think needs to be contextualized correctly. And I think with that contextualization, it becomes less problematic when we take a look at these stories. So Ragmala, yeah, it's interesting. So Santokh Singh, he's, as I mentioned before, Santokh Singh is somebody who's very cognizant of source material. In his writing of Suraj Prakash, he is looking at, okay, what did Bhai Mani Singh, what did other people write before me? And then he's very consistent with that material. I think in a similar way, um, it's that approach that he takes when he's looking at Ragmala. So he does say, just for the record, that yeah, Ragmala is not the writings of the Guru, and that's going to be interesting to a lot of people because they think that that controversy occurred in the early 1900s with the Pasorye, with the lot associated with Akhand Kirtani Jatha. The debate goes back a little bit prior to that. And we know that because other people like Nirmala has also mentioned this, that some Nirmalas are against Ragmala as well. Yeah, so it's not fair to say that that debate occurred only in the early 1900s. That had some type of debate prior to that. Now, Gurublas Pachayachemi, no, I've not looked at the manuscripts entirely, but Gurublas Pachayachemi does mention that Ragmala is Gurbani, and in the Pai Mani Singh Sarup of Ad and Dasam, there is Ragmala there as well. But Santokh Singh's argument is based on source material because he's looking at a poet named Alam, and he sees that a very, very similar text is identical, that Alam is writing, and it's dated to prior to the construction of Ad Guru Granth Sahib, or Ad Granth, in 1604. So he's looking at that and he's seeing that, okay, Alam Kavi has written this prior to Guru Arjan Dev Ji's construction of Ad. So therefore, that's one reason it can't be Gurbani. The second reason is that he's looking at Gurbani and he says that, I think this is the argument that he writes. I could be corrected, but he writes that in every line of Gurbani there's talk about Nam, and there's talking about Amrit Ras and these type of elements, Bhakti, and in this composition of Ragmala there is none. And so he uses these two elements to conclude that Ragmala is not Gurbani. So that is an interesting component because it shows that there was some type of controversy prior to the Akhand Kirtani Jatha kind of leading the charge on that front. But yeah, certainly I think that's his argument on that.